This demo shows how to leverage Office 365 online with an on-premise solution like DynamicsGP2010. The first thing we're going to do is create an expense report in Office 365. We will then submit via workflow to our manager for approval. Once our manager approves, we'll send it to the accounting department for them to review and approve and to start the processing to create an AP invoice automatically in DynamicsGP through a web service. Once the AP invoice is created in DynamicsGP, the expense report is completed, and the employee is notified of the completed process via email. I'd like to spend a few minutes and set up my demos. I have two demos with a theme of island hopping in the cloud. The goal is to offer some simple techniques that will bridge document and information simply and seamlessly between online and on-premise, with the idea that some information starts in the cloud and needs to end up on-premise. Here we have Office 365 living in the cloud, and I want to leverage Microsoft Excel both in the cloud and on-premise as a bridge between extranet and intranet. I'll pull some summary information out of Excel and use it to create an AP invoice in DynamicsGP on-premise. So the goal here is to action something in the cloud and bring it on-premise through Microsoft Excel as a bridge to the on-premise intranet. The second part of this demo is based on the theme of the first part. Again, actioning in the cloud with Office 365 to process the expense report in the cloud and to bring it on-premise and to submit to DynamicsGP through a web service. But this time we'll automate the process from Office 365 of using a workflow to send a message on-premise to SharePoint and action that mail message in SharePoint on-premise. So a quick recap. We're going to leverage Office 365 to process an expense report and then use workflow to send a mail message to a folder in SharePoint on-premise, and then SharePoint will create an AP invoice in DynamicsGP. Let's take a look at the demo. Here we are in Office 365, and I've added a library to capture my expense reports called Fabricam Expense. I want to go to the Documents tab and select that to create a new expense report. Creating a document will bring up an expense report that I can fill out in Excel. Here we see a standard Excel expense report, and I'm going to fill out a little bit of pertinent information to purchase a new computer for Tim. Here we see almost complete report, and I've filled in a value for the vendor ID of the value of Tim, and this is the vendor that will be transferred over to DynamicsGP when we call the web service. Notice that the spreadsheet did a lookup of the value of the vendor to ensure that it was a good vendor, and return back a value that says Tim is a good vendor from the lookup. Now we want to save this spreadsheet on Office 365 and begin the workflow process. The expense report is now in the library and workflow is started pending approval of the manager. Let's review and approve this expense report as the accounting user, and that will create an invoice in DynamicsGP. We approve the expense report, and now we'll complete some information in the accounting use only block. Completing this information will enable us to trigger an event to drive a AP invoice into DynamicsGP through a web service. We see the web service return a result code of 0 indicating that it created an AP invoice in DynamicsGP. The expense report now shows a status of posted indicating that it posted to DynamicsGP. Now let's go look at that over in DynamicsGP. Let's look up in DynamicsGP the AP invoice that we just created. We now have an AP invoice ready to be paid to Tim for the purchase of the new computer. Let's do a quick recap and set up what we're going to do next. We just saw Excel being used as a bridge between Office 365 in the cloud and on-premise with DynamicsGP in a manual operation. The next part of this demo automates that. We actually will go through an approval process, again using Excel, but now we have workflow that happens in the cloud with Office 365 that sends a mail message over on-premise into SharePoint, where we then action and create an AP invoice automatically. So this is an automated approach versus the previous approach, which is really purely manual of bringing Excel on-premise and actioning from there. We're now going to take that same expense report and action that in a different way. We're going to put a value in the status field of auto post, and that's going to tell Office 365 workflow that we want to send a mail message over to DynamicsGP and create an invoice through the on-premise implementation of SharePoint. The expense report is now back in the library, and Office 365 workflow has kicked off the Fabricam expense. You'll notice that says in progress. This is sending a mail message to the on-premise implementation of SharePoint that will allow us to action the create process for the AP invoice. The mail message has now been delivered to the workflow mailbox, and an on-premise service will pull that mail and submit that to SharePoint for processing the AP invoice in DynamicsGP. We're now seeing the on-premise implementation of SharePoint waiting for the mail to be received from the Office 365 mailbox. A quick refresh of the browser shows the mail coming into the mailbox and workflow starting on the on-premise SharePoint side to move that into DynamicsGP. The on-premise SharePoint process has now completed that workflow and submitted that AP invoice into DynamicsGP. The workflow updated the log with indication that it moved that invoice into DynamicsGP. Let's browse the AP invoice screen and see the invoice that we just created through the web service. We see the AP invoice is now in DynamicsGP, ready to pay Tim for the new computer. In the workflow that was sent from Office 365 into that mailbox, the workflow mailbox, is now empty because we moved that into SharePoint and then into DynamicsGP.